information. So a very esteemed panel of people here who are accomplished thinkers, and excited to learn from you all about mental models, and just kind of share the insights with the audience. And then hopefully at the end we'll save some time, and if you want audience members to ask a question about mental models or about Knowable, go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll try to get to you. So Ryan, you talked about the first one as inversion thinking. Give a quick one-line summary about that, and then maybe we can kick it to Andrew to talk about how he uses inversion thinking, or if he uses inversion thinking as an investor.
Sure. So it's something a lot of us actually do. It's really centered on paying attention to what could go wrong instead of what could go right. So when you're faced with a problem, or you're evaluating a situation, whether it's a business or personal life, by asking yourself, okay, how can this thing go wrong? How can I mess this up? You're able to sort of back into solutions potentially that at the very least will help you avoid problems, and at the very best will help you get to potentially unexpected answers.
Yeah, it's funny because I think the thing is, what we talk about, it's one of our portfolio founders, this wonderful founder of PlanGrid, Tracy. She actually she and I had talked about what was one of the most important things that she did for her company that allowed her to go and sell it for hundreds of millions. And it was actually this thing called, she says everyone does pre-mortems, where effectively you try to figure out what's going to cause a project to fail. But the other one that she talked about was not enough people also do pre-parades, which are similar, right? You work backwards from the problem. So if you both do pre-parades and you do pre-mortems, it's a really good way to go and see what are the potential areas that you might have issues with in the future. So you can basically foresee how you'll succeed, and also foresee how you might potentially fail.
So I love that term pre-mortem. It encapsulates the entire philosophy of inversion thinking in just one word.
Totally. But I haven't heard pre-parade, Andrew. So is that basically like visualizing, here's the path of everything going right?
Yeah, that's right. Like she says that pre-mortems happen quite a bit. I mean, it's the same for inversion thinking, right? Which is to start with, work backwards from the end, with the end in mind. But I think that it's pretty interesting there. I do want to say also, I'm so happy that Knowable and Warren and you guys are doing this, primarily because my wife told me, she's like, take notes. These are all the things that I've been talking about in our relationship. This is very important. It's not just applicable to business. It's also applicable to the many things. So I'm here to go and upgrade my life, and I hope all the audience members are here to go and upgrade their lives too.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed these lessons, and it was 10 minutes a day, and each day covers one framework and kind of talks about the history of the framework and how to apply it. And on in inversion thinking, Ryan, and this idea of pre-mortems and even pre-parades, you used Amazon, I think, as an example in the lesson, where when somebody pitches a new product for Amazon, the first thing they do is write the PR statement. And if the PR statement doesn't sound really compelling and feel like something that somebody would want to use, they don't invest in the product. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a forcing function to make yourself think about things in a way that might not be totally obvious. So a natural inclination for a lot of people is to pre-plan for what can go right. How do I do this how do I accomplish this goal in an affirmative way? And this model, when you're thinking deliberately through this lens, is forcing you to turn that upside down and kind of plan for the opposite. And thinking that way can hopefully reveal some answers that you might not have thought of otherwise. Amazon uses this. A lot of big companies use this. Warren Buffett, and he has a business partner called Charlie Munger. They're sort of the OGs of bringing mental models into the business sphere. So they existed before Warren Buffett and before Berkshire Hathaway, but mostly in the spheres of academia. But these guys were really thoughtful about introducing these concepts into the business world, and that ultimately ended up becoming so influential for so many businesses. Warren Buffett is obviously a titan and a leader for anybody who's aspiring to accomplish great things, and they talk about these things all the time, and it's so it really resonates how much they come back to these different ideas. And it's not just inversion thinking. There's another concept we talked about on Thursday called the circle of competence. And it might seem obvious. It's sort of knowing what you know, but it's also knowing your boundaries and operating within the confines of what you know, not overextending yourself, and really using sort of humility and intellectual honesty to self-reflect and make decisions within the confines of your circle of competence.
Awesome. Thanks for that overview. Okay, so we talked about the first mental model covered in Knowable this week, which is inversion thinking, basically thinking about what could go wrong and that informing what you should not do. Adam, I want to get back to you for some examples, but why don't we move on to the second one, which is process thinking that was covered in Knowable this week. And Ryan, can you give a quick summary of what process thinking is? I know we talked about it a little bit at the beginning.
Yeah, we touched on it at the top. It's basically about perfecting every repetition in the process of preparation. So not thinking about the past, not thinking about the future, not focusing on the desired outcome, but focusing only on the exact moment that you're in. And Nick Saban, he's the all-time greatest. Regardless of college or pro, he talks about every play on the football field having a life of its own. And they use this reference of the average football play is only 7 seconds. People mostly don't realize that. Only focus on those 7 seconds. Do your best within the confines of those 7 seconds. And once they're over, forget them and focus on the next 7 seconds. And I find that one to be really powerful. And like we said at the top, very popular across athletes or across sports, among athletes and coaches and leaders in that field.
Adam, you're basically an athlete of the audio world. Do you have any thoughts on either of these two models so far? Have you come across somebody who's really great at using inversion thinking or process thinking to drive better decisions or outcomes?
I mean, I do think of Ira Glass as someone who does both, I would say. Ira Glass, I think most people know who he is, but he's, the man who more than anyone has really created long-form audio production. And he's somebody who achieved enough by 15 years ago, certainly, that he could have easily retired and or just phoned it in and have be in the top person in the Hall of Fame of our industry. And what I so admire about Ira is he's just, that 7 second thing, although in our world maybe it's a little longer than 7 seconds, but if you randomly grab him at any moment, maybe he's having a meeting with some Hollywood big shot or thinking, but most likely he is sitting at his computer trying to fix a moment in audio, and that is what he does. And he's never very far from doing just that, just focusing on this moment here. And I've found many times when he's been editing stories I've done where he's wildly more accomplished than I am, and he's accomplished so much, and we'd kind of get the story to where I was like, it's pretty good, and he would spend hours just digging in. All right, let's just get this moment right. Is that the right way for that sentence to lay out? Did we write it right? So that process thinking for sure. And then also, yes, the heightened paranoia of just a real muscle memory. And that's certainly something I have. A muscle memory for pitfalls in storytelling, which I found over the course of my career, it eventually just becomes embedded. Like the inversion thinking instantly becomes more of a positive thinking. Like that was actually something I had to work on for a long time, because it took me a long time to realize there's this voice in my head that I write a paragraph and it sucks. And my brain says, oh my God, that sucks and you suck.
Right. The inner critic.
The inner critic. And to realize, oh no, that inner critic is the voice that allows me to be a good writer. And Ira Glass, again, has a great speech he gives about this, that if you are a creator of any kind, early in your creating process, you're probably more than the average person going to recognize how crappy you are at everything you try to do. But that's a wonderful thing, because that's a sign that you have this sensibility, that you understand what good is. You just don't yet know exactly how to get there. And that
you have taste, but not skill yet.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say the single best thing for my personal happiness, I think, is converting like self-loathing inversion thinking into productive inversion thinking. Like, because yes, like I was talking to someone the other day, and I was like, a professional writer is not someone who writes well. It's somebody who's willing to stick with crappy writing longer than other people.
Totally.
And when I write poorly now, I'm less likely to spend time thinking I'm a terrible writer, and more likely to, definitely to think, okay, what's the worst version of this story? What's the most boring version or the most offensive version or whatever? But then also, it's sort of that process thinking, like, okay, in the past, here are the steps that get me from this stage to the good stage. So yeah, I would say that really resonates with me very much.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, it's always comforting to hear somebody who seems so accomplished in their field, to hear them say, oh, I still struggle with self-doubt. And, just focusing on that process is still a challenge.
If you ever find a writer who doesn't, then they probably stop writing well. I remember someone said the definition of a professional writer is someone for whom writing is far more difficult than it is for most people. So, yeah.
Funny. Yeah. Not to digress too far, but a great quote I've heard in writing is basically content wants to be mediocre. So it's the English writer who has to go and, fight mediocrity at every turn.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, I think it also reminds me of that I believe that it's the statistic that Beethoven, some of his greatest work was during the period, referring back to this Ira Glass and storytelling quote that you're talking about, Adam, that Beethoven, in fact, created some of his best work during the time when he was focused on processing. He was just actually making a huge volume of work, which some of it tended to be fairly mediocre, but then some really great things came out of it too.
Yeah, that is a buddy of mine, Dan Rubin, who has a book out right now. It's about writing story. It's a great book. But that was advice he gave me early, and I've seen him give to many young people, which is to become a good writer, and this applies beyond writing, but to become a good writer, write badly a lot. and that's, I think I certainly in my 20s really focused on, I'm going to create that perfect, precious, beautiful gem. And when I look at the best work, at least in my opinion, it often is stuff I tossed off, not in the midst of trying, doing the sweaty work. So yeah, I think that's good.
Little do we know, Adam's greatest work was something that he made in 2 hours on a very late night. He just tossed it away.
On the writing front, before we move on to the next framework, I think the Tom Brady probably of novels is Stephen King, and he's very famous for trying to write 10 pages each day. And so that he's just another example of process thinking at its best, and that accumulation of gradual work and focus on a small task that accumulates over time. All right, so Ryan, do you want to give an overview of the third framework that was covered in this week's Noble lesson?
So next is circles of competence, and we framed this lesson using an anecdote of Ted Williams, the baseball player. Everyone knows his name. Maybe not everyone knows a whole lot about him. He is universally known as the greatest batter ever in baseball. He holds records to this day, 80 years later after he played, and sports records do not last 80 years. So it really just an all-time great. And he became great not just out of by way of pure talent, but he actually was a person who self-studied and examined himself and his practice and his performance in a way that might be somewhat common today in an age of sports science and everything is data. But in the 40s and 50s, this sort of discipline and idea of self-examination was literally unheard of.
He's like the OG of Moneyball, basically, right? He was a baseball player who looked at data before anyone else did.
Literally, yes. So he took the strike zone. So that's like the box where the pitches pass by in front of a batter. And he subdivided that strike zone into 77 baseball-sized units. No one was doing this. You might see this now when you're watching MLB on Fox, but this was a completely novel idea back in the day. And he applied a score or a sort of a batting average for each of these different zones within the broader strike zone. So he would know exactly which pitches he was most likely to hit. And that may sound quaint now, but this was completely, no one was doing this back in the 40s and 50s. And we're not kind of retroactively, applying this title of Moneyball OG or first ever baseball quant. He literally wrote a book called The Science of Hitting, and he broke down this kind of self-study process of how he became the greatest hitter ever. So anyone can go buy it on Amazon.
And he's still a record holder, right? That's
so he is one of, I think, 37 players ever in the history of baseball to bat over 400 in a season, meaning he got a hit 4 out of 10 times. 40% might not sound like a lot to someone who doesn't know baseball, but like that's crazy. No one does that. He's a prime example of someone who used this idea of the circle of competence to understand what he was good at, knowing what his sweet spot was. He talked a lot about the sweet spot, and that what is.
Oop, I lost you, Ryan. But you're talking about Hank Williams and his sweet spot and circle of competence, and basically him just knowing what he knows or what he's good at and finding that sweet spot of strike zone is what made him a great batter. And basically, I know you talk about this in the Noble lesson this week, but Warren Buffett, who's one of the most successful investors of all time, is very famous for passing on investments that he doesn't feel like he has some circle of competence knowledge. Yeah,
exactly. And they were huge fans of Ted Williams. They talk about him all the time. You can go look it up. They reference him over and over again. And they applied this same theory of the circle of competence to investment. And they said, we only invest in what we know. And if we stick to our sweet spot, we're going to have a higher likelihood of success. If we operate outside of our own domain, if we start to reach into spaces where we're not as proficient, where we're not as knowledgeable, we're upping the possibility of risk for ourselves and for our money as investors. Obviously, they have been very successful in what they do by sticking to what they know.
So, Adam, anything that you know in your circle of competence, or any anecdotes from your distinguished career where you've seen people play to this strength really well, or vice versa?
So talking about great writing and Ted Williams makes me think of the great John Updike short story, Hub Fans Bid Kid Adieu, which is about his last at bat. And it's just this amazing story of basically Ted Williams' willingness to take a risk at his very last at bat, and then his refusal to come out and take any applause. And actually, my dad, Jack Davidson, happened to be there, and then for selected shorts, my dad, who's an actor, read that story. So you can hear my dad reading that story online somewhere. But it's just a beautiful story that I think captures that idea that it's about the work, it's about the hitting the balls, and for him coming out and just giving the audience what they want, giving the crowd what they want, giving a little bow, would have violated what baseball was to him. It also made him a jerk and a half, which apparently he was, but it's a beautifully written story.
Awesome.
I just want to point out, I think that for those who are Gen Zers in the audience, Adam is describing Ted Williams as doing what is known as a low-key flex after not go ahead and take a bow.
Yeah.
But Ted Williams would punch you in the head for saying that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying he would. Yeah.
So just to reset for anyone who's joining the room a little bit later, we're talking about mental models. Mental models are frameworks that help people make better decisions. Annie Duke, a poker champion, has this great quote that there are basically two things that determine the quality of your life: luck and the quality of your decisions. And you can't control the former by definition. So we're talking about how do you make better decisions. And on knowable.fyi, in the app this week, we have a bunch of free lessons on mental models. Each day we cover one mental model. So far, we've talked about the first two, or actually three: inversion thinking, process thinking, and circle of competence. And Ryan, do you want to give a summary of the fourth mental model? And then also want to hear from Savannah, who produced the lessons on Knowable this week, and see if what she kind of took away from this week's learnings.
Sure. So the last model that we covered this week, and we'll definitely cover more in the future because there are lots of them. It's called first principles thinking. And it's centered on this idea that as we're approaching problems, as we're trying to make business decisions or life decisions, we're coming to the table with inherent biases, preconceptions, assumptions, et cetera, et cetera. What first principles thinking entails is stripping away those preconceptions, eliminating any sense of foreknowledge about or assumptions,
preconceived notions. Yeah,
exactly, about an idea that you're approaching, and breaking them down to their fundamental elements. So really boiling down complex issues to only the things that we know to be empirically true, just the definites, not the maybes, the definites. And by looking only at those definite ideas as it relates to a problem or a decision, we're able to hopefully reveal solutions or lead our way to decisions that we might not have come to otherwise. So Elon Musk, obviously, everyone knows Elon, one of the most successful business people out there today. He's an advocate of first principles thinking. He's someone who talks about this a lot. He talks about it publicly. And he uses this framework to make decisions as they pertain to his business that might not be so obvious. So we use an anecdote in the lesson on Knowable where they were at Tesla. They were negotiating over very expensive batteries and purchasing them overseas and from third-party suppliers and yada yada yada. Their team thought backwards. They said, okay, these batteries cost X when we're buying them from this third-party supplier, but what if we look at the elements that go into producing these batteries? How much does it cost to buy the component ingredients, these different chemicals and whatever, to produce them? And what they ended up doing is, instead of buying them from a third-party supplier, they ended up making them. And there was an initial sort of capital expense to build up the ramp to produce these batteries, but over the long term, they're saving 80% on the cost of these batteries by deconstructing the problem, deconstructing the cost of the batteries, the elements that go into producing them, understanding how do we buy these, where do we buy these, what do they cost, and they did it themselves. And that's a good example of thinking through a lens of first principles, right? Instead of relying on the third-party supplier, break it down, do it yourself, and they ended up saving 80%.
Yeah, so I think the big takeaway for me from the idea of first principles thinking is that just because something is the way it is doesn't mean it's true. Just because other people think that something is true doesn't make it really true. A lot of fallacies get perpetuated, and certainly today on social media. And so you kind of have to go a layer deeper, and that's where some of the biggest insights lie. And so obviously Elon Musk did that with batteries, as you mentioned. The spot price was $600 for a battery, and now Tesla's making them for, I think you said $60 or $80. So
it's easy to go with conventional wisdom, and that's sort of comfortable for most people. What this mental model requires is kind of thinking more carefully about the ideas and assumptions that you already have. It takes a little bit more work, but it ends up oftentimes to be more valuable, more effective when you're making decisions.
Got it. So, Andrew, anything that you want to add on this one on first principles thinking? You're an investor at Initialized Capital. Anyone that you see do this particularly well, or how do you think about this framework for making a great decision?
Yeah, when we tend to make investment decisions, we do think about waves that are happening within the market. So this is probably one that folks know a lot about, but in the world of technology, right? If you believe from a first principle in Moore's law that compute is basically halving in terms of price continually, that means that things that might be very expensive now will be cheaper in the future. For example, we're worried about Bitcoin, or we're worried about Google. In the past, really focused a lot on adopting and using Moore's law as a means of continually being able to increase compute to everything that they were doing. And I think that's a pretty important point, because if you know that something is true, you sort of take that first principle and you take it to its nth degree. And I think there's something pretty powerful about that as well.
Thanks. So Savannah or Adam, anything that you guys want to mention on first principles thinking?
I can just jump in quickly and say, and this is an idea out of the passion economy, which is sort of, without going into a whole long thing, although I would happily go into a many hours long thing, the idea of the passion economy is that we had a fairly well-structured economy in the 20th century, that we all, even if we were born after the 20th century, were raised in that kind of thinking. And, there's a handful of ways to make a career. And once you picked a career, by the time you were 23 or 25, the path was pretty clear, with a few minor choices. And now we see this in the creator economy. We see it in so many economies, and so many parts of the economy. We're all making it up. Like, we're all creating new ways of having a job, having a business. The difference between being employed and being an entrepreneur is blurring. The kind of way you make money, et cetera, is blurring. And to me, that is about having a first principle that is, instead of just what is the external rule, like I'm going to be a lawyer, so I'm going to go to law school, then I'm going to be an associate, thinking really, what is the value I can create that nobody else can create? What is the audience that wants that value? And then how do I create a structure that connects me to that audience? Which used to mean you had to raise a lot of capital or just get a job somewhere and compromise a lot. And now you get to ask that question continuously and reinvent yourself continuously. So I think I would argue that first principles thinking in your own life and business is more relevant than ever. It's basically the whole ballgame.
I think this one is so powerful. It really goes to this idea of first principles thinking. Kind of another way to say it is, what do you know to be true? And introspection is such a powerful way to know what you personally actually believe to be true, rather than what society says you think should be true. So that you gave the example of parents basically saying, "Oh, go be a lawyer or a doctor," and that's the sign of success in society. But I know so many doctors and lawyers who are deeply unhappy, and I think what you're espousing with the passion economy is that people choose professions because they skip over that first principles thinking of figuring out what do they actually want to do, what excites them personally. And luckily, with the passion economy blooming today, more people are able to do the things that they're passionate about and also make money from it. And so skipping that first principle step of finding out what do I like, what gives me energy is a big fallacy, and it's a sure way to have a lower quality life than you otherwise would.
That's one of the first principles, is basically what is valuable to me, but then also how do I provide value? So maybe, I don't know, Warren, 30 years ago, what would you do if you had a passion for teaching people? You could go be a professor, you could be a high school teacher, but it was unlikely that you would be able to come up with an idea like Knowable, get funding for it, et cetera. So it's, I think of it as there's value creation. What is that thing that I can passionately do that actually creates value in the world? And then there's value capture. What is the business structure that allows me to capture the value I create? And both of those things are newly relevant.
Yep. Okay, so just to refresh where we're at, Knowable.fyi has 4 free lessons this week on mental models. mental models help people make better decisions. The 4 that we covered and that Ryan and Savannah produced are up on the panel are inversion thinking, process thinking, circle of competence, and first principles thinking as well. So we've talked briefly about each 4 of those. Adam and Andrew, you guys have been kind enough to share some of your thoughts. I know, Andrew, you have a bunch of other mental models that you use as an investor and out in the real world. But also, Savannah, I know that mental models, you produce these lessons on Knowable, but you had not heard the term mental models before. Anything that struck you, or any questions that you have for the group about mental models as somebody who's new to hearing about that term?
Yeah, so hey everyone, maybe you recognize my voice from the beginning of each lesson.
Can you do it? Can you say this is knowable?
This is knowable.
Nice. The voice of knowable. Thank you, Savannah.
Yeah, there you go. So yeah, I had never heard of mental models before, but it's interesting that while I was producing these, I realized that I used a lot of them like without realizing it, especially process thinking. Like we're producing an upcoming series about habits, and I noticed the overlap there where with habits, you build basically processes for yourself that you do every day, and that way you can achieve a certain goal. But I was also interested in this idea of like, okay, Warren said that mental models are there to help you make better decisions. So I was wondering if I could kind of like posit a like dilemma that my husband has and see if we could apply a mental model to solve it.
Ooh, yeah, I love that. A mental model in practice.
Yeah, so
it's always easier to solve someone else's problems too. And this actually is, I've been reading this book by Amy too called How to Decide. And this is a common thing where it's easier sometimes to diagnose a friend's issues and make good decisions for them than it feels to make decisions for yourself because of all of the clouded thinking. But anyway, go ahead, Savannah. Excited to hear what thing your husband is considering.
Okay, so he is currently working as an assistant to an agent at a television and literary agency, and he's been there for a year, and now he's applying to a couple jobs. Job A, he just interviewed for, and he's excited to hear back, but there's job B that he wants even more, but they're not doing interviews till the end of the month. In the event that job A wants him to, wants to proceed with him, what should he do? Like, should he go with them, or should he hold his, cards and kind of think, oh, but I want job B more? Like, what could we do to solve that?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've got the guy who wrote the book, The Passive Economy. So I think Adam, you should opine on this one.
Sure. Well, I mean, the beginning would just be some questions like, what I often think if the job you're switching to, you should be thinking about what's the next step as well. So is the next step, does he want to be an agent? Does he want to be on the creative side? Does he want to be in production? Can you answer any of that, or do you want to be?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, good clarifying question. So he is an assistant to an agent, but he wants to be a writer. But it's hard to get into writer's rooms. So he's kind of trying a different angles. So job A would be an assistant to an executive at a production company. And job B would be an assistant to a writer. And so that's why he wants that one more. But he knows that jobs come and go really quick. So he's like, well, if I don't get job A, then what if job B doesn't go well? And so, yeah, that's kind of another part of the dilemma.
Great. So to me, a first principles issue is he knows what he wants to be. And so he should be doing things that are pushing him closer to that, to being a writer. And then, so he should look at this through that lens. Now, a production company executive, my brother's a production company executive, they can have access to a lot of writers, they can talk to a lot of writers, but it's probably not actively learning about the writing. So, I mean, my main question would be, I thought I saw John August in this room. I don't know if he is, he should raise his hand, and you don't have to say who the writer is, but is the writer a generous writer? I've worked with a lot of Hollywood writers, and some are unbelievable. Like Adam McKay is just one of the most generous, creative people I've ever met.
Say who Adam McKay. Adam, say who Adam McKay. What he wrote.
He wrote The Big Short, Vice, all the Anchorman movies, Talladega Nights, and he's like a brilliantly generous writer. So being his assistant, like you can actually see many of his assistants have made movies because he's supported them. I've worked with other writers who I won't name who are much less generous, and it's almost like working with them is almost taking you farther away. So that would be something I would want to know a lot based on this writer. If you want to text me who the writer is, I can, without publicly crapping on anyone if I happen to know.
Well, let's try to use the framework though. I mean, given what we know, and try to kind of apply it to this real world situation that everyone deals with. Right? Is you've got two jobs. One of them you kind of like less, but it's maybe it's a bird in the hand, and the other one that feels maybe a riskier, but the one you want. I think everyone has probably had this experience at some point. So Adam, you mentioned first principles thinking as a way to, as a model to kind of arrive at job A or job B being the right answer. Anybody else want to take a swing at applying one of the other models that we discussed? Or, I know there's some other ones here that we can think about too.
I'll chime in. This is not a model that we covered this week on Knowable because I thought it was almost too obvious, but thinking through the lens of opportunity cost, it's actually one of the most common and well-known mental models that people use every day.
Totally.
But like the other models that we've talked about, it's a forcing function. You're looking at a problem, you're making a decision, and it's especially valuable when you're weighing between two options like Savannah's husband is. What benefit am I sacrificing by taking job A versus job B, or job B versus job A? And it might sound simple, but it's actually a helpful way to reevaluate problems through a more deliberate framework. And that's what mental models are all about. Now, every problem is multivariable. It's like, how much does this job pay? Do I have to go into the office every day? How much FaceTime do I get with the writer? What's the trajectory? So, you don't want to oversimplify the decision-making process, but I think the big takeaway for me learning about mental models was applying them in a way to reveal answers that I might not have come to otherwise. And they're not always the right answers, but they're different answers. And the more information, the more options I have sort of collecting and synthesizing the data in front of me when I'm making a decision, the better off I'll be able to.
Right. I think so. Opportunity cost is another great example of a mental model. I'm going to do one last reset for this room, just to recap what we've learned here so far. So mental models are ways, for the tools that people use to make better decisions. Making a better decision is basically the single thing that you can do to improve the quality of your life, because everything else is effectively luck, right? Whether you choose option A or option B, there's going to be some component of luck as to whether that turns out to be the right decision. So we've talked about inversion thinking, process thinking, first principles thinking, and circle of competence as 4 frameworks. Ryan, you just mentioned another one, which is opportunity cost. Annie Duke is a famous poker champion, and she's written a book called How to Decide. And she breaks up this great point of, oftentimes when people are making a decision between two things, they'll have a pros and cons list, right? Like, here are the pros for option A and here are the pros for option B, or job A and job B in the case of Savannah's husband. And what that ends up being a really blunt tool, and what she recommends is actually doing an expected value. So you think about how valuable something is to you and what the probability is that it will turn out to be true. Or vice versa, what's the probability that a really negative outcome will happen? So I think that's another way to think through the decision that Savannah's husband is making. But Andrew, I want to open up to you as well to give any thoughts on how to apply mental models to this real world example that Savannah offered of her husband trying to decide between job A today or probably better job B, but that is less of a sure thing.
Yeah, so I have 2 in mind. One is one that Jeff Bezos uses. He calls it the regret minimization framework. So that one is effectively like, if you have a choice between 2 things, you just ask yourself, in the future, which one are you going to regret the least, right? So the idea is it's almost like a meta mental model to a certain extent, because what you're doing is you're taking all the other mental models that you actually care about, and you're just using this, you're filtering it through the lens of regret. So for Savannah, I think for her partner, the question should really be like, which one is he going to regret the most? I mean, he's like, okay, if I take it now, will I regret not knowing the answer for the other one? And I think that's a pretty important one. The other one that I would say is actually a mental model that's used in math called it's called the Sultan's Dowry or the Secretary problem. And this one's pretty funny, which is basically, before you try to make a decision, it's actually used in dating quite a bit sometimes. Like when you were in high school and you thought that you had fallen in love with somebody, and your mother might tell you, hey, maybe you should go meet other people to figure out whether you're truly in love, and you should sample, for example, everything that's out there. This particular one actually tells you that, hey, if there's a certain number, you want to have a couple jobs before a certain time, you need to basically, if you could say interview at 10 places, when do you stop? Do you stop after the third one, the fifth one, the seventh one, or you wait until the number 10, right? The problem is you can't always go back. So I think the key here is to focus a lot on the question of when do you know that this one is better than the average or better than the sample? So again, that one's called Sultan's Dowry or Secretary problem. That's a really fun. Classically it's called stopping problems, but effectively it tells you actually the number is usually if you're going to do 10, right? It's 10 times 1 over E, which is about 0.37 or 37%. So you actually just try to go through 37% of what you potentially could go through, and gives you a pretty good sample of what you could potentially have.
This is basically the don't buy the first house you see rule too.
Correct.
Right? Like you need to get a sense of what's the total value, because you see the first house and you're like, what a great deal. But there's no data to really inform, and so you're basically over indexing on the availability bias, I think but the
thing is, you also don't want to wait until the end, right? Because you don't want to buy the last house that you see. So how do you balance between both satisficing and optimizing? And I think that's a tough mental model to have to deal with, right? So, but this one helps in that regard.
Awesome.
Can I just throw out a couple? I think this is inversion thinking and circle of competence, but I might not understand them right. So truly, like if you're choosing between being a production company executive, entry-level executive, and being a writer, entry-level, you really are walking on two very different paths. And so when I think about the inversion thinking, like we know what happens to people who go into production company executive work, or I do, because my brother does. I have a lot of friends who've done that. And the money is more, at least in the beginning. It's more of a steady thing, and then you're just on this track. And so really thinking through, okay, it's 5 years from now, I'm now making 3 times as much money. I'm now a junior vice president trying to become a senior vice president. Am I more likely at that point to quit all that to start writing? I would be thinking a lot about that. And then the circle of competence makes me think, what does your husband want to be good at? If he wants to be, because if the way to be a good writer mostly is to write, a good mentor is incredibly helpful. But at the end of the day, you have to type. That's the way you become a good writer. And, some people just get a job, just like they wait tables or whatever, so that their mind is not occupied by their job. But being a production company assistant, that's a big job that's going to be really demanding. So to me, using those two rubrics, I just keep coming back to the same thing. If he wants to be a writer, then all of those models lead me to think he should just either wait for that job, and if that doesn't come through, he should just have a job. He should just write. Basically, he should write. Yeah.
He knows what he wants to do. What a gift, right? To know what you want to do really clearly. I feel like, especially probably a young guy, you can probably take some risk. But it's obviously risk is subjective.
I also just want to point out that we just solved Savannah's partner's problem, and I don't know what Adam's billing rate is, but I know that Knowable's free, so I think this is a pretty positive thing.
I know. Wow, Savannah, I feel like mental models might have saved the career of your husband, and they're free. You can learn about them. For anyone who's just joined the room, this Teach In is powered by Knowable.fyi. We have free daily lessons, and this week's lessons are all about mental models. We cover 4 of the most popular ones, and we're talking about some of the ways that people use mental frameworks to improve the quality of their life here. So I do want to acknowledge we've got a couple of other people up on the stage with us. Augustine is a journalist, so if he has a question, we'll tee it off to him. But then Laura, thank you as well for joining. Do either of you have a question that you want to ask or comment?
Or you can suggest a mental model. You could also absolutely suggest a mental model that you love using.
Well, this is a really interesting room. These days I'm a writer, and I just wanted to comment on how to use mental models to achieve what you want to do in life. Because I have an example. When I was in my late 20s, I got offered a job as a producer and a part-time anchor at a big television station. And it was a steady job, and I was young, and I didn't have any much money. I didn't have a good apartment, so it was a really good offer. And then at the same time, I got offered to work for 3 months as a summer temp on another television station, which was a more prestigious work. So there I was with no money and really no big future, and I had to pick a choice between a short-time solution that was more prestigious or something that would be more safe and would take care of my day-to-day life. So I've used models to try to get ahead all my life. So what I did was I thought about what are my long-term goals and what decision is going to be the best for my long-term goals. So I turned down the steady job. It was one of the most difficult decisions I've ever made in my life. And a lot of people around me said I was crazy because the other job was very good. So I worked for 3 months. I got to stay there a long time, and then I just propelled into doing some even better things.
So how long ago did you make this decision to take to turn down the safe path?
20 years ago.
Okay, so you had enough time to figure out, okay, that was you feel like that was the right decision.
Well, the interesting thing is that it had a consequence, and that's what I wanted to say, that once you have made a big sacrifice to follow what you really wanted to do, the next time it's easier. So because you'd already made a sacrifice for what you want to do, so it's easy to stay on the track to making those kind of sacrifices. So I've had 3 or 4 times later in life, I've had to make similar decisions. And I've always picked the long-term goal, and at the moment I'm the editor of the biggest weekend edition in Swedish newspaper business. I'm the editor of the Saturday edition of what would be the Swedish equivalent of the New York Times. So, and I would have stayed at that steady job if I had gotten it. So then I would have gotten nowhere in 20 years. So that's just my.
Thank you for sharing. So I think this is another point to the real world question that Savannah posed, which is, should her husband take a job that is maybe inferior to another one that is less certain to come in as an offer? So thanks, Augustine, for sharing your thoughts. So I want to invite Laura and Sydney. Either of you have a question or a comment or a different mental model that you want to discuss?
And I want to recognize Laura for her, she runs Tech Talk, which is usually with a number of the Chinese audience, which is great. But she's also a researcher at Harvard. So I'm sure she has some really amazing things. Sydney has been an individual who has defeated an individual on chess. Actually, he's one of the first individuals to really do that on Clubhouse. So, which is kind of a fascinating thing. So I'm sure he has a number of mental models to go and share as well. Laura or Sydney, I'd love to hear kind of whether it's you have a question or a problem that we can put a mental model to, or if there's a mental model that you guys love using.
Laura, you want to go first?
Oh, she might be. She's still muted. Why don't you go ahead, Sydney? Go ahead.
All right, sure. Well, I'd love to toss a bone in terms of a thought that actually applies really closely to chess, which is when to use what mental model and when you can actually go wrong with a mental model. Because I think this discussion really centered around what can go right and how you can actually use it to improve your life. But I think when you think through mental models in chess, because there's no variance in terms of like random luck, you can actually really clearly see when someone uses the wrong mental model in the wrong situation. And I'm kind of curious about how people apply that in life, where you can apply, the two job decision, where you might have one mental model that tells you one thing, and then another mental model that tells you the exact opposite, and how you kind of balance that. And my second real question, I think the other one's a much bigger discussion topic that you probably can't solve in a few minutes, but one question I do want to pose too is how you actually integrate the correct mental models in systems. So for example, the plan grid example I think was a really good one. Right before you create a new product, doing some pre-mortems, super, super smart. It's a system you can do every single time and help your company make better decisions. So how can you actually integrate a mental model within a system that you can do on a regular basis? And what habits do you have around that?
Oh, go ahead.
I can speak to the first question, and I think it's an important one and something we didn't touch on yet, which is what's the negative example of a mental model? Not all mental models are good. Not all are productive. There's ones that actually work against us, and they're super common. So one that most people probably know is something called the availability bias or availability heuristic. and basically that model, it compels us to sort of over-index on things that are easily recalled, the things that are most frequently coming across our radar, or the things that are happening most recently. So basically, it's a model that tells us to, or influences us to make decisions based on things that are recent or frequent, as opposed to what's actually the most important. So it's very easy and to kind of rely on information that's at our fingertips, but oftentimes the most useful information in terms of making decisions is not the most convenient. So that's one example of something that's of a model that can be counterproductive.
I think, Sydney, I just want to recap your question. So basically you're saying, how do you know which mental model to use when you're trying to answer a decision as well as answer a question and make a decision as well as possible? And I think you're right. Certain tools are right for certain jobs. So using a screwdriver to, hammer in a nail is less efficient than using a hammer. And so I think what we talk about in Noble this week in the free daily lessons are, to go through using all of the different models and trying to figure out which one it feels like the right tool. And Circle of Competence is the other model that we talked about, which is, do I actually know something about this domain or this area of expertise, or do I need to seek new knowledge to make a better decision? Because if I just rely on my gut and I don't have, competence in this area, I'm making a mistake. How does that sound to you, Sydney?
Yeah, totally. I do think it's very difficult, though. I think it's actually very difficult to figure out what to apply when. And in chess, it's especially apparent because, you might know the principle of two weaknesses, but if you don't know when to use it, and a beginner player will never know how to use it, you will not improve at all. Actually, your chess game might even get worse if you try and apply the principle of two weaknesses every time you can. So it's just very difficult to know when you're actually using it correctly.
Yeah. I mentioned Annie Duke a couple of times already on the chat. She is a professional poker player, and she wrote a book called How to Decide. And look, she basically says that what you want to do is create an expected value tree. So you lay out all of the possible options that could happen. They rank them in order of, most pleasant and beneficial to the worst outcome, and then actually try to guess probability of each one and figure out, okay, what's the likelihood that I'm going to have a positive outcome if I make this decision? But obviously, you have to do something similar in chess, right, where you are taking a risk and basing
I think actually
each move on.
this is exactly how like some of the great grandmasters like Hikaru and others. I mean, I'm not nearly as good as Sydney at the world of chess, but I've watched them at least enough on Twitch to know that I think that they do create the same thing where there's a sort of hierarchy of values. They're thinking about their first principles because they're really actually working. The weirdest things for those folks, they work backwards, right? So they're doing effectively the inversion thinking where they know where they want the board to go, and then they work backwards off of that.
Thanks for adding that. So Sonia, you came up on stage. Did you have a question or comment about mental models? And then after your question, I just want to mention to everyone who might have joined recently, this is powered by Knowable. You can find the website at knowable.fyi. We have free daily lessons on mental models. They're available, and we cover each lesson in 10 minutes. It's an audio first lesson, so you can kind of turn off your Zoom, go for a walk, and learn in more depth about some of the different models that we're talking about on this call. But anyway, Sonia, a question or comment from you?
Yes. Hi. As we were talking,
Hey, Sonia, you're actually not coming through for me. I think we've got a bad connection. So why don't I see if Laura's available while you try to get to a better spot. Laura, any comments or questions from you?
I wonder if Laura's getting a bad connection too. Something's happening in the world of the internet.
I know that my internet crashed this week, and then AT&T basically said it came back on, and they basically said my modem broke because the internet crashed.
Hey, while we're waiting for maybe some other additional guests, or while Laura and Sonia are fixing up their internet, can I offer another mental model that I think?
Yes, that'd be great.
So one of the ones that I tend to use quite a lot in investing is actually what I call the iron triangle. And effectively what it is when you think through most industries, there's usually, you can actually think through them through three players. So the good example of this is in the world of when people think through, they're building a company and they're like, okay, well, I care about quality, I care about quantity, and I also care about cost. Right? Or sometimes it's usually quality, speed, cost to a certain extent. And you can optimize, you can't optimize for all three of those things. You can generally optimize for one of those or maybe two of those. But what that means is the iron triangle, this is called the iron triangle because if you cater toward two things, then the third thing that's part of that triangle will necessarily not be very good. So if you cater for quality and speed, you're probably going to have to increase cost. If you increase cost, if you decrease cost and you're increasing quality, then you're probably not going to be very fast. And that's one that is a great mental model to think through because it can be applied to both your career. It can be applied. I say this to a lot of folks when they choose their careers that you can choose between substance, salary, or setting. And you can't have all three. Even I used to work in Washington, D.C., and for the Small Business Administration and helped do some advising for areas of the White House. And the truth was, even the President of the United States was not happy with those three things, right? Like almost every single President of the United States thinks that they're paid too little, which is probably true. But then, I think there's something to be said about thinking through not just, what are the possibilities out there, but thinking through what are the trade-offs and the constraints that are available too. So the iron triangle is a really good one that I tend to use almost all the time because it's a good way, instead of thinking in binary thinking, it's interesting to think about it from in a sort of triangle way of thinking.
Thanks for sharing that one. So iron triangle, just to refresh as a mental model, basically you can have 2 out of 3 with quality, speed, or cost. But it's really difficult to get all 3 at once. Is that right, Andrew?
Yeah, and it's also used in like the political bureaucracy as well when they talk about interest groups. So if you look it up, you'll find it. There's a number of different things that it's used for. Like in the Iron Triangle in Congress, they actually say it's like clout, background, and outlook. But in general, it's basically you can't. There's something about the power of 3 where you can't have all 3 things, but you should at least know that whatever you're doing, there are 3 things that probably matter in whatever process or work that you're working on.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that other mental model. So Tanisha, you raised your hand. Did you have a question or a comment on mental models?
I'm really enjoying this conversation. My question is, which one do you like the best? Which model do you find very helpful and you like the best? And the reason why I ask this question is because I work with and mentor women and girls who live in shelters and also who are in inner city schools who really don't have a lot of confidence and come from homes where there's a lot of trauma. So yeah, I'm just curious to know which model do you like better, like using better for that type of situation? Thank you, and I'm done speaking.
Thank you, Tanisha, for the compliment and for joining and for the work that you're doing and the thoughtful question. So I think which one is do we like the best? And we talk about this in Knowable, but basically mental models are tools to help you make decisions. And so different tools are right for different jobs. And I think this is Sydney, who's a great chess player, was up on stage earlier and basically posits this point of not every framework is right for every decision. And so part of the challenge of using a mental framework is knowing which tool to use for which job. And so you don't want to use a hammer to screw in a screw, and you don't want to use a screwdriver to hammer in a nail. And so what we found and what we talk about in Knowable is trying to look at each problem through all of the mental frameworks and figure out which one gets you closer to an answer. So just to recap for anyone who joined the room late and as a refresher for everyone who probably already has forgotten the mental models that we've talked about, inversion thinking. This is basically thinking about what could go wrong, kind of thinking about worst case scenarios and trying to avoid the decisions that will lead you to a negative outcome. Process thinking is a really big one. And I think this is, if I had to guess, for somebody who's going through a difficult period, process thinking is really powerful because basically it says you want to focus on what's in your circle of control rather than what's in your circle of worry, right? And so really just focusing on, one foot after the next in terms of what do I need to do to have a good day in order to have a better week, in order to have a better month and a better year. But the other two that we talk about on Knowable this week is circle of competence. So making a decision in areas where you already have some knowledge is really important, and knowing where your knowledge lies and where it doesn't lie. And then first principles thinking is another really important one, which is just because everyone thinks that something else is true doesn't actually make it true, especially for you, right? So I think that the quick answer to your question, and then I'll pass it off to the panel as well in case anyone wants to opine, is different problems require different frameworks to solve. And what you'll learn on Knowable is how each one is used, what are some of the use cases for each one, and that will often illuminate what the right framework is for the right problem. Thanks again, Tanisha, for your question. So Sonia, did you want to try to ask a question or comment again? I know we had some bad service earlier.
Yes, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. And I think one of the things that I was relating to when Savannah was speaking about her husband's potential jobs was that I sometimes get like indecision fatigue, where it's just like there's so many, like I go through the mental models and I think through like everything, and then it just ends up confusing me even more. But one of the books that really helps me was Meg Jay's The Defining Decade, where she kind of starts talking about why we get fatigued when we're trying to make a decision. And so I'm just going to read, I found the quote. She says, the not knowing, Ian pretended that not knowing what to do was the hard part, when somewhere inside I knew he thought that making the choice about something is when the real uncertainty begins. The more terrifying uncertainty is wanting something and not knowing how to get it. It is working towards something, even though there is no sure thing. And for me, doing the inversion thinking kind of always led me down like the harder path, because I would just think about all the negative stuff instead of trying to think about not just the positive. I think one of the other things she mentioned is that we don't know how the future is going to, turn out. So sometimes by only thinking that you have the two decisions and not realizing that once you make one decision, that helps you make a whole other sort of decision, because it opens up so many more options, ended up like helping me the most. So I don't know if that like helps anybody else too, but that certainly helped for my indecision fatigue.
Yeah, there's a term that I really love. First off, Sonia, thanks for the comment and the quote. There's a term called emerging properties. And that's a framework basically that says once you make one move, new possibilities open up that you can't even foresee, right? So just moving to a different city, you can't forecast every possible thing that might happen. And I think there's kind of that leap of faith that you sometimes have to take and trust that new windows open, even if, some doors close. Savannah, you posed this question, basically a real world example of your husband's trying to decide between a job that is available today or a job that he prefers but is not yet for sure available. Do you feel like there's a framework that we discussed that is helpful in evaluating this decision? Do you feel any more informed about how to apply a mental model to the decision that he's making and that probably pretty much everyone in this audience has ever faced?
Yeah. I think it's interesting how you can look at it through a bunch of different lenses or models. I think what I'll be passing along to him is just kind of evaluating. I liked the idea that Andrew shared about regret minimization and just kind of forecasting, like, okay, when it's like 10 years down the road, which one will I have like regret least as far as the decision I made? And then I also think what Adam shared about really weighing, like, okay, which path could this potentially take me down? Because I guess that might have been inversion. I'm still kind of getting used to which ones are which. But yeah, I mean, it's true that like in Hollywood, sometimes you kind of have to take an adjacent path, but you also don't want to go too far down the road. You want to always keep your goal front and center. So I think those frameworks I'm going to be passing along to him. And I appreciate everyone who has helped weigh in on this issue. It's definitely good to know, because I've been in that situation before too.
I think everyone has. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Warren. I just want to go and emphasize that, like, Savannah, this was not planned. Savannah's husband has this issue where he has all these job opportunities, and we solved it live on the air with you, the Noble team, Adam Davidson, and all this, you applying mental models. And I think that's a pretty powerful thing. Because being able to do that, it means that, I don't know, but I've taken a lot of tests all throughout school, but this is probably the most useful one that I've ever taken.
Yeah, so I know a lot of people joined a little bit late, so I want to do a quick recap. What we talked about in this room, and what an amazing discussion on mental models. Mental models are tools or frameworks that people use to make better decisions. Annie Duke, she is the author of How to Decide and a champion poker player. She has this great insight, which is basically there are two things which determine the quality of your life. One is luck, and the second is the quality of your decisions. And you can't control luck by definition. So really the only thing you can do to make your life better is make better decisions. And mental models are frameworks and tools that people use to improve the quality of their decisions. So on knowable.fyi, you can find a link to our app, and we've got free lessons this week on mental models. We talk about four of the most popular ones. They're 10-minute lessons per day, audio first. The first one we talked about is inversion thinking, basically thinking about what could go wrong. Another term for this that Amazon and a lot of tech companies use is a pre-mortem, thinking about how something fails and thinking about avoiding that, right? So you might think if you have a diet that you're trying to stick to, a surefire way to fail at that diet is, having donuts in the house every day. So you would basically think how to avoid doing the thing that will lead to a likely failure. A second mental model that we talk about on Knowable this week is process thinking. And basically, Tom Brady famously put out a video of thinking of the process to a game, not about the outcome, but just trying to win each whatever it is called round. I'm obviously not a football guy. Ryan, you can correct me on that one. First principles thinking is the other model that we talk about on Knowable this week. Elon Musk is a very famous proponent of first principles thinking and used that to lower the price of batteries at Tesla, just by thinking about what the component costs are of a battery rather than just assuming that what the market price is the most efficient price. And then circle of competence is another mental framework, and a lot of investors like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger use this to really focus in on making bets where they already have some knowledge and acknowledging where they don't have knowledge so that they can avoid making decisions that aren't within their area of competence unless they have additional knowledge. And then, Andrew, you were kind enough to share some other mental models like the iron triangle and regret minimization. So maybe we will be covering those in future lessons on knowable.fyi. This was such a great discussion. I learned a lot about mental models, and I'm inspired to dig deeper. I learned a lot. Thank you, Ryan and Savannah, for producing the lessons this week on Knowable and sharing them with the audience. Adam Davidson is a writer at The New Yorker. He's the co-founder of Planet Money. He's basically the OG of podcasting, or the Tom Brady of the audio world. Tanisha and Sonia and Laura, thank you for joining the panel. Andrew, Ryan, anything else that you guys want to add?
I just want to say that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ryan.
I wanted to cap off just with one takeaway. Some folks who came on stage asked, which mental model should I use in this situation? And there's not a single answer for any one person at any one time. You can apply different models in different situations, and they're always case by case. But I think the high level takeaway, what I learned and will stick with me, is mental models help us to take the passivity out of the decision-making process and really introduce a sense of deliberation and rigor when making decisions. And they can apply to business, they can apply to life, they can apply to family, anything. But if nothing else, they make us think harder and make us think better. And the more deliberate we can be about our decision-making processes, how we navigate the world, how we navigate business, I think the more successful we'll be.
And I just want to go and add that, if I can apply these mental models so I can be more like Tom Brady, who hasn't eaten a cupcake in 20 years, maybe that's the key, like the things in life that we try to do that allow us to think better. It's hard, right? But the thing is, it's actually simple frameworks that allow us to go and make small decisions, and then those small decisions compound upon themselves, and then we can win multiple Super Bowls. And we know that is it worth it to go and give up cupcakes for 20 years if your mental model supports that?
Yeah, there is some component of luck, I guess, but mental models are what we can control, and so focusing there certainly helps. And I'm actually glad you mentioned this, Andrew, because I want to mention on Knowable this week, all the lessons will be around habits and why they're important, how to make them, cultivate good habits and get rid of bad habits. So Ryan, anything you want to mention about habits on this week's lessons? And then also, we'll be back next week, same time, sharing the lessons that we've learned on Clubhouse.
Yeah, we have 4 new lessons coming out on habits next week. Just for anyone listening, on Knowable.fyi or in the App Store, just search for Knowable. We're publishing new 10-minute lessons every Monday through Thursday, and each week will be capped off by a live conversation here on Clubhouse, where our members and our listeners can discuss and ask questions, just like we're doing today. So habits are coming up. We have a series on focused leadership coming up. We have a series on management, communication, and the language of leadership coming up. So lots of interesting, high value, super actionable lessons in the pipeline, and we hope to have you on Knowable listening.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I think this week's lessons on habits are going to be really powerful. Obviously, James Clear has a great book called Atomic Habits, but we're going sharing some other insights beyond that too. I do want to see if Mengdi, if you had a last question or comment. We're probably going to wrap here in 5 minutes right now.
Yep, I just wanted to add a little bit, since I'm working in artificial intelligence and I kind of know some concept in reinforcement learning I thought would be helpful for humans too. So like, for example, for reinforcement learning, you find a best policy. And I remember you mentioned like minimizing regret. So I guess these concepts are all kind of like quick iterative learning. So I think, so I'm also personally an improv enthusiast. So I think that will also be helpful. Like, so I think one good thing about improv is that it reduces the time between your mind and your voice. So it makes you to quickly interact with the environment. So, and then quickly get, it's also kind of like a multimodal learning. Like you use your voice, you use your eyes, you interact with the team. And so I think these are all like, just something to add to like build a better habit to get a better interact with the environment. Does it make sense?
So elaborate on how you think about improv as a mental model.
So I think it's just quickly interact with the environment to kind of get feedback on your thoughts and just quickly update iteratively on your on your knowledge. Yeah, does it make sense?
Right. Yeah, so on Knowable, we actually have a course with the Upright Citizens Brigade, which is the leading improv comedy troupe. They basically came up with the concepts that great improv comedians use, like saying yes and basically seeing where one kernel of an idea can take you when you follow that thread. So I think this is another term for this in practical day-to-day life is emerging properties. And Sonia kind of mentioned this too, that once you make one decision, new branches open up that you couldn't have seen in advance. So Mingy, thanks for that comment. We did just have a bunch of people join the room. So I want to do a quick refresh. This is powered by Knowable. You can find us at knowable.fyi or in the App Store. We're an audio-first learning platform. And every Monday through Thursday, we put out a 10-minute lesson around a weekly theme. This week's theme was mental models, how smart people use great frameworks to make better decisions. Next week's theme is on habits. And so every day you'll get a free 10-minute lesson that you can listen to, and then it'll culminate in a live discussion here on Clubhouse. So Andrew, I'll do a quick recap and then see if there's anything else that you want to mention. But we covered 4 models today: inversion thinking, process thinking, first principles thinking, circle of competence. In the discussion, we also talked about the iron triangle, basically the trade-off between speed, quality, and cost. And then another framework too for making great decisions is regret minimization. I also mentioned Annie Duke's book, How to Decide, and she's a big proponent of creating expected value trees for decisions. A lot of people use pros and cons lists to try to weigh 2 options, but those are really flat because they don't tell you how great the outcome could be or how negative an outcome could be. They're not weighted. So I'll pause there and again see, Andrew, if there's anything that you want to add.
Well, the one that I think that I did bring up, which I think will be great for everyone's weekend conversations, is the Sultan's Dowry or the secretary problem. I think Mangi probably already knows about this since she's in the world of machine learning, which is that, for everyone out there, I'm sure you have friends who are dating, and they're probably wondering, well, I could maybe date 10 people. Should I wait until the 10th person, or should I stop at 3? Should I stop at 4? Should I stop at 5? This mental model is fundamentally about being able to figure out when you should stop, because you want to optimize at the same time, but you also want to satisfy, because who knows, you don't want to buy the first house that you see, but you also don't want to buy the last house that you see because you don't know if that one's going to be better. So take your mom's advice, or which is get to know other people and sample. So whether it's in the world of dating, whether it's in the world of jobs, whether it's clubhouse rooms, whatever it might be, basically sample. And math has an answer for this, which is if you can see 10, then take 10 and multiply it by 1 over e, which is about 37%. So about a little less than half. If you do that, then you'll be able to go ahead and figure out what your average is. And the next one that comes along that's better than the previous ones that you've experienced, that's the one that you should immediately take, because you have a high likelihood that it probabilistically will be one of the best choices that's out there for you. The mental model is actually very simple, which is sample. Go check out all the things that are out there. But it's funny because a lot of these mental models, once you dive into them, have all this amazing data that really backs them up and makes them pretty amazing.
Yeah, I love that one. I mean, I think this is such a fallacy, especially that people in their 20s make, is they take the first thing that comes their way, right? The first job offer, they see the first house or the first apartment to rent, and they think that that's the right one, but they don't have enough data to make an informed decision. And so what your model suggests is you kind of want to look at about 30% of the available options before making a decision, right? You want to talk to a few different job places before you say yes or no, or look at several apartments before making a quick decision. And I think this one, it ties to me into this principle that we talked about on Knowable this week, which is really your circle of competence and knowing what you know and where you are actually have limited information, because most people think that they know more than they do. Stephen Hawking has this great quote, which is that the enemy of knowledge isn't ignorance, it's the assumption of knowledge, right? We think we know what a great deal is on a house. We see a first one and we're like, oh, this is a great house. But you actually aren't competent yet and haven't explored the available data set properly. Andrew, if you've got a few more minutes, I just want to see we've got a bunch of hands raised. And so see if there's anyone else that has a question about mental models, about Knowable.
Well, I also wanted to recap for folks. I think it's amazing that we solved Savannah's problem, which is that Savannah's partner is choosing between, either interviewing now or interviewing later, right? And that's a tough problem that everyone has. And we applied this first principles thinking, and we applied mental models to thinking through the Jeff Bezos regret minimization framework, for example, like, hey, would I regret not taking this job, or would I regret actually not being able to go and interview and check out the next job? And it's interesting how, it's funny because all these rooms out there on Clubhouse sometimes are just like, hey, how do you get rich quick? The truth is, like, most things are actually both, they take work, but they're also very simple. Like the decisions that we have are actually very simple. And I think that's the key with some of these wonderful mental models, is that the greatest lessons are actually some of the most simplest lessons.
Totally. Thanks for sharing that, Andrew. John, you've been waiting for a while. Did you have a question or a comment on mental models that you wanted to share with the panel?
Yes, I do. And I've appreciated what you've been saying. They're very good examples and advice. There's a class of mental models that I didn't hear mentioned. I was actually a professional scenario planner with 2 different companies. And the idea of creating scenarios for a possible action or a possible decision has built in the idea that you don't want to have a single point of view. You want to have at least, say, 3 or 4 different versions of what might happen. And the way we would do that is we would try to say, what's the strongest force that isn't coming from us, that's out there in the world and that is going to influence the future? And we try to isolate some of those forces. And then we'd say, suppose that force, it's showing up now as strong. Suppose it dominates. What's the narrative? What would happen? What kinds of things would go together, including the kind of surprise changes of circumstance that come out if, say, like a better battery, much more efficient batteries. It would be an example of an external force that's going to come in. It's going to change not only electric vehicles, but the power grid and any number of things. So,
totally.
Yeah, it's just another way of thinking about it. It's usually not done as an individual, although one of my colleagues did 4 scenarios for his marriage. We kidded him quite a bit about it, but it is an important discipline. It's something that's very useful if you have a group of people that are going to make a consequential decision, and that it's very complex and a lot of variables, and that the idea of writing a narrative around which of the significant forces in play tends to dominate. It's not that you're going to absolutely get the right one by doing that, but by forcing you to create 4 different narratives, and in each one a different force dominates, that alone will open up your mind to lots of possibilities, and it'll give you some clues, some things to look out for, like, oh, if I see this starting to happen, that's a clue that we're probably moving into that scenario and we're moving away from this other scenario. So,
Warren, I feel like John has been listening to Noble, or he knows the next lesson plan.
I do know about Noble, yes.
Okay. I know that sounds like an informed question about mental models. So, just for anyone who's joining us now on Noble this week, we have free 10-minute lessons each day. This week's lessons are all about mental models. We've talked about a bunch of them in the room. And John, what you're talking about is effectively second order phenomenon, right? So we have an example would be electric cars become mainstream, and now you have all these new businesses that come about because electric cars are available, right? So you have batteries becoming way more in demand, or cobalt becoming more in demand. So anticipating what's to come based on a first move is often a way to make a great decision or a great investment.
Right, or Clubhouse luminaries jumping onto Clubhouse, and all of a sudden we find a bunch of people who will help people become Clubhouse moderators, and all they really need to do is just learn how to talk and actively listen. Those are lessons they need to learn.
Those are fundamental skills. We'll probably have a course. We actually do have a course on Noble called Speak with Confidence. It's hosted by Celeste Headley, who has one of the most popular TED Talks of all time. And her TED Talk and what she talks about in the course is basically people don't have conversations and actually listen, right? Most of the time they're thinking about what they want to say next. And that is basically a surefire way to have a bad conversation. And Will Hines, who leads our UCB improv course had a really great tidbit, a gem, which is basically if you wait half a second before you answer somebody's question, the quality of your response goes up dramatically. Anyway.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's rare on Clubhouse, I guess, because we want to fill this dead space. But basically, what happens is it gives time for your prefrontal cortex to actually think of a rational response rather than just your lizard brain coming up with what's top of mind. But anyway, I don't want to digress too far. That'll probably be a topic of another discussion. This week on Knowable, we talked about mental models. Next week, the lessons are all about habits. So for anyone who's joining now or doesn't know about Knowable, we're an audio-first learning company, and you can listen to a 10-minute lesson each day and start to build a habit of learning something useful each day. Habits are really powerful. Just like mental frameworks, they can improve the quality of your life on a subconscious level because you think about brushing your teeth without actually having to use too much mental energy. That's a habit. So if you can move more things to autopilot, especially good habits, that's a sure way to improve the quality of your life. So looking forward to those lessons next week. But Justin, you came up on stage. Did you have a question or comment about mental models?
Yeah, no, just a quick little comment. This has been a wonderful discussion of mental models, and I think just to echo what everyone's been saying, I think it's the accumulation or the use of all of these mental models together in order to get us outside of our blind spots and help us become better decision makers. It's neat to hear talking about second order thinking, probabilistic thinking, inversion, circle of competence, and even we have Occam's razor, Hanlon's razor. There's a lot of great mental models, and even mental models that we can use from physics, relativity, thermodynamics, self-preservation. It's neat to take these time-tested true principles and apply them. One thing that I was fascinated by the discussion, how do you know which mental model works? I think for me, at least, it's been, I don't know initially, but then to create a decision journal. So in the moment to identify, write down the complexities, write down the alternative solutions that you considered, write down your perspective range of outcomes, and then what you decided, and including writing down how did I feel, what were the biases I might fall into, and then 6 months later revisiting that decision you made, just so you can, hold yourself accountable to see your thought process. And then finally, going on to what Annie Duke talks about, separating the difference between the decision and the outcome or the result. There's a difference there. A lot of times we think, okay, if it was a good result, that must have meant I made a good decision, which is not necessarily. We talked about luck, and sometimes we get a bad result and think it was a bad decision process, but sometimes it was just bad luck. And so that was just my thoughts, and I really enjoyed this conversation.
Hey, Justin, thanks so much for the comment, and glad you enjoyed the conversation on mental models powered by Knowable. So you mentioned Annie Duke, and I'm such a big fan of hers. I'm actually looking at her book, How to Decide. And she, for anyone who doesn't know, is a poker champion. She wrote a book called Thinking in Bets, and then she wrote How to Decide. And really, she has this great quote, which I mentioned at the start of this conversation, and I'll repeat now, which is there are two ways to improve the quality of your life. One is to have better luck, and the second is to make better quality decisions. And basically, by definition, you can't influence your luck. So really, the only thing you can do is find ways to make better decisions. And what you're talking about, she mentions in her book, is oftentimes people judge a decision based on the outcome rather than the quality of the decision, right? So I might decide, hey, I'm going to buy a bunch of Tesla stock. And if the Tesla stock goes up, I think, wow, I made a great decision. And if the Tesla stock goes down, I think, oh, I made a bad decision. The quality of the decision, though, is the same, right? It's like, did I over index on a risky stock? If so, that's probably a bad decision, regardless of the actual outcome. So I'm glad you also brought up journaling. And I think we should probably end on this one because it's such a powerful thing to do. But I'll speak from personal experience, which is I'm the CEO of a startup called Knowable. And every time I make a big decision, I write down why I am making that decision, because often what will happen is I will then down the road question it. And having a journal in the moment is so powerful and so helpful because down the road, it becomes obscured by the actual outcome, right? So if I make that decision and things go great, I often won't consult the journal, but if it goes bad, I will go back and think, why did I make this decision? And having a journal, a memorialization of decisions is really powerful. So thanks for mentioning that, Justin. Just to recap, thank you to our panelist, Adam Davidson. He's a writer for The New Yorker. He's basically the Tom Brady of audio. He started along with Alex Bloomberg, Planet Money, which is basically the best podcast that NPR started, in my opinion. And thank you to Ryan Duffy, who's the producer of this week's lessons and next week's lessons on Knowable. This week's lessons were on mental models. He did that along with Savannah Wright, who's also at Knowable. And really, I learned so much from this week's lessons. Basically, in under 45 minutes, you'll learn about 4 of the most common and powerful mental models. Andrew Lee, you're an investor at Initialized Capital, which invests in early stage startups before product market fit. And so your job is to make great decisions. And I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts on mental models, including some of the additional ones that you mentioned, like Iron Triangle and regret minimization. Thank you to Tanisha and Mengdi for your questions, and John and Sonia as well. I think we're going to have to hop here. We're way over time, but want to encourage everyone to check out Knowable, either in the App Store or knowable.fyi. This week's lessons are totally free. Andrew, anything else you want to add?
I'm just wondering if Adam had something that he wanted to go and add to end with, just because he's the Tom Brady of the world. I hope you've been able to eat a cupcake in the past 20 years, though.
Yeah, no, I definitely am not the Tom Brady of body. I kind of wanted to end with a shout out to Scottish 18th century philosopher David Hume, who was a very big believer in reason and using reason. He's sometimes considered the first real atheist who created a morality independent of God. But he would always point out reason is an incredibly powerful tool. I'm thinking of reason as a mental model, but it is your passions that truly drive you. So you need to know that reason is a tool to get the things you're passionate about, but that passion is the fundamental thing. Reason can't lead you to the right decision for yourself. That has to come from something that can't be reasoned. So that's not to say mental models aren't phenomenal. They are phenomenal, but they're phenomenal to a goal that is just whatever it is you happen to want out of life, which isn't the product of a mental model, if that makes sense.
Yeah, great first principles thinking, actually, right? Which is know first and foremost what you want, and then use mental models to optimize decisions around getting that goal.
Warren, this just makes me think that I have to come back next week, because it's clear that I may not be able to go ahead and solve with myself, but I might have to just get better tools to help me get to the point that Adam was talking about.
Well, really excited about the upcoming lessons this week on Knowable. As a reminder, they're totally free. It's the App Store is just find us as Knowable or knowable.fyi. We're going to be talking about habits, and we'll be back here next week, same time. This was an amazing discussion. Thank you again to Adam Davidson, who's the co-founder of Planet Money and a contributing writer to The New Yorker, for sharing his thoughts on mental models. Andrew Lee, and all of your thoughts on mental models and how you apply them as an investor at Initialized Capital. I think we're gonna unfortunately not be able to get to all the questions, but feel free to tweet at us at knowable.fyi, or feel free to tweet at me at wwshafe, and we will try to answer your questions. Many answers in the Knowable app as well. Thanks to everyone who joined, and wishing you all a great Friday. Bye, Andrew. Bye, Adam.
Thanks, Knowable.
Bye, Sonia. Bye, Mengdi. Bye, Justin. Thanks again.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.